The morning mist hung low over Millbrook, Massachusetts, a forgotten town nestled between rolling hills where time seemed to move differently. Elias Thornton, 73 years old with hands weathered like old leather, knelt in the damp earth of his garden as the first rays of sunlight filtered through the ancient oak trees that bordered his property. His knees protested against the cold ground, but he paid them no mind. This morning ritual had become as essential to him as breathing. He reached into the worn canvas bag beside him and pulled out a small piece of paper, folded with the precision of someone who understood that some things deserved reverence. Written in his careful script was a name, Margaret Chen. She had been the town librarian for 42 years before the cancer took her last winter. Elias remembered how she would save the best gardening books for him, sliding them across the counter with a conspiratorial wink. With a small trowel, he dug a hole exactly 6 inches deep, no more, no less. The soil was dark and rich here, fed by years of compost and care. He placed the paper gently into the earth, as if tucking a child into bed, then covered it with soil, patting it down with the flat of his palm. His lips moved in silent prayer, though the words were his own, not borrowed from any scripture. From her kitchen window across the street, Sarah Mitchell watched the old man, through the steam rising from her coffee mug. She had been watching him for 3 years now, ever since she moved back to Millbrook after her divorce. Every morning, the same ritual. Sometimes he would plant 5 names, sometimes just 1. On Sundays, he would plant none, but would walk among his garden rows, touching the earth where he had buried his papers, his mouth moving in that same silent recitation. Sarah had tried asking him about it once, catching him at the grocery store, but Elias had simply smiled, his blue eyes crinkling at the corners, and changed the subject to the weather. The town had long since written him off as harmless but eccentric, a widower who had perhaps lost a bit of himself when his wife Clara died 15 years ago. But Sarah wasn't so sure. There was something deliberate about his movements, something that spoke of purpose rather than madness. That particular morning, as Elias stood and brushed the dirt from his knees, he noticed Sarah watching from her window. Their eyes met across the distance, and for a moment, neither moved. Then Elias raised his hand in a small wave, and Sarah found herself waving back, her coffee growing cold in her other hand. Later that day, Sarah stood in the produce section of Murphy's Market, absently squeezing avocados while her mind wandered back to the garden. Her daughter Emma, home from college for spring break, chatted beside her about her psychology courses, but Sarah only half listened. She was thinking about the way Elias had looked at her that morning, as if he was waiting for something or someone. "Mom, are you even listening?" Emma's voice cut through her reverie. "Sorry, honey. What were you saying?" Emma sighed, pushing a strand of dark hair behind her ear. "I was asking about that old man who lives across from us. Mr. Thornton? Jenny's mom said he's been acting strange for years, burying things in his garden." Sarah placed an avocado in their cart, considering her words carefully. "He's not strange, Emma. He's just processing something, I think." "Processing what?" Before Sarah could answer, a familiar voice spoke behind them. "Processing is a good word for it." They turned to find Elias standing there, a basket of tomatoes in his weathered hands. His eyes were kind but guarded, like someone protecting a valuable secret. "Mr. Thornton," Sarah said, feeling oddly like a child caught gossiping. "We weren't—" "It's all right," he said, his voice carrying the soft accent of old New England. "People wonder. It's natural." He looked at Emma with interest. "You're studying psychology?" Emma nodded, suddenly shy under his steady gaze. "Then you understand that grief takes many forms," Elias said simply. "Some people cry, some people rage, and some people—" He paused, seeming to weigh his words. "Some people plant gardens." The conversation at Murphy's Market stayed with Sarah through the evening and into the next day. She found herself at her window again the following morning, but this time she didn't pretend to be doing anything else. She watched openly as Elias performed his ritual, this time with 3 pieces of paper. When he finished and looked up at her window, she was already pulling on her coat. The garden gate creaked as she pushed it open, announcing her arrival. Elias didn't turn around immediately. He was kneeling by a patch of ground where small green shoots were beginning to emerge, despite the early spring chill. "I wondered when you'd come," he said without looking up. Sarah stopped a few feet away, suddenly uncertain. "You don't mind?" "No." He stood slowly, his joints protesting audibly. "In fact, I think I've been waiting for you. Or someone like you." She noticed his hands were trembling slightly, though whether from age or emotion she couldn't tell. "The names," she said softly. "Why do you bury names?" Elias gestured to a weathered bench near the garden's edge, and they sat together, the morning air crisp around them. For a long moment he said nothing, his eyes scanning the neat rows of his unconventional cemetery. "My Clara started it," he finally said. Near the end, when the Alzheimer's had taken most of her memories, she would write down names of people she didn't want to forget. She'd hand me these little papers and make me promise to keep them safe. His voice caught slightly. She said if the names were planted in good soil, maybe the memories would grow into something beautiful, even if she couldn't tend them herself. Sarah felt her throat tighten. Her own mother had suffered from dementia before passing 2 years ago, the grief still fresh enough to sting. "After she died," Elias continued, "I kept doing it, but not just for her names anymore. For everyone in this town who passes on, everyone who leaves, everyone who gets forgotten. The grocery clerk who always asked about your day, the mailman who knew everyone's dogs by name, the teacher who stayed late to help struggling students." He pointed to different sections of the garden. "They're all here." "But why in secret?" Sarah asked. Elias smiled sadly. "Because grief in America is supposed to be quick, clean, contained. You get your 3 days off work, your funeral, your sympathy cards, and then you're supposed to move on. But some of us, we need more time. We need ritual. We need to mark the passing in ways that make sense to our hearts, not to social conventions." A door slammed across the street, and they both looked up to see Emma jogging toward them, her breath forming clouds in the cool air. "Mom, I've been looking for you," she called out, then slowed as she noticed the intimate scene. "Oh, sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt." "It's all right," Elias said, standing. "Would you like to see something?" Emma looked at her mother, who nodded encouragingly. Elias led them to a corner of the garden where the plants grew tallest and most lush. "This section," he said quietly, "these are the pandemic names. 23 people from Millbrook. The Zoom funerals didn't feel like enough, so I gave them this." Emma knelt down, reading the small markers he had eventually added to some spots, tears forming in her eyes. "My professor would call this a form of continuing bonds therapy," she said softly. "The idea that healthy grief doesn't mean letting go completely, but finding new ways to maintain connections with those we've lost." "Your professor sounds wise," Elias said. Sarah noticed a section of freshly turned earth with no growth yet. "These are recent." "This week," Elias confirmed. "Tommy Brennan, aged 7, leukemia. His mother doesn't know I planted his name, but someday when she's ready I'll show her what grows here." They stood in respectful silence, 3 generations united by the universal experience of loss. Finally, Emma spoke. "Mr. Thornton, would you mind if I documented this? Not to expose you, but I think people need to know that there are different ways to grieve, different ways to honor memory." Elias considered this. "Let me think about it," he said. Then, reaching into his pocket, he pulled out a small envelope. "Sarah, this came for you yesterday, delivered to my box by mistake." Sarah took the envelope, recognizing the return address immediately. Her ex-husband's lawyer. Her hands shook as she opened it, scanning the contents. New custody arrangements, another battle, another loss. "Bad news?" Elias asked gently. Sarah nodded, unable to speak. Elias reached into his canvas bag and pulled out a piece of paper and a pencil. "Write it down," he said simply. "Not his name, but what you're losing. Write it down and we'll plant it. Sometimes the only way through grief is to give it to the earth and see what grows." 3 weeks passed before Sarah returned to the garden with her own name to plant. Not a person's name, but something else. The family I thought we'd be. Emma had returned to college, and the custody battle had intensified. Sarah found herself seeking the quiet sanctuary of Elias's garden in the early morning hours when sleep eluded her. She found him already there, but he wasn't alone. A young woman sat beside him on the bench, her shoulders shaking with silent sobs. Sarah recognized her as Maria Santos, whose husband had died in a construction accident just 2 months ago, leaving her with 3 young children. Elias looked up at Sarah's approach and nodded toward another bench. "Maria is planting today," he said simply. Sarah watched as Maria knelt in the soil, her hands trembling as she placed multiple papers into the ground. Not just her husband's name, Sarah realized, but all the dreams and plans that had died with him. The house they were going to buy, the anniversary trip to Puerto Rico they'd been saving for, the dance at their daughter's wedding that would never happen. "My mother-in-law thinks I'm crazy," Maria said, her voice hoarse. "She says I need to be strong, to stop crying, that Miguel wouldn't want me to be sad, but I can't just turn it off." "You shouldn't have to," Elias said firmly. "Grief isn't weakness, Maria. It's love with nowhere to go. Here, you give it somewhere to go." Days, as Maria finished her planting, Sarah noticed others beginning to arrive. First, old Henry Chen, Margaret's widower, carrying a small bag. Then the Brennans, Tommy's parents, their faces drawn but determined. Word had begun to spread in the way things do in small towns, through whispered conversations at the post office and knowing looks at the grocery store. By the time the sun was fully up, 12 people had gathered in Elias's garden. Without formal invitation or announcement, they had come to plant their grief. Sarah watched Elias move among them, offering guidance here, a gentle word there, transforming his private ritual into something communal. "This is becoming something bigger," Sarah said to him during a quiet moment. Elias nodded, looking both pleased and apprehensive. "Clara would have liked this. She always said grief shared is grief diminished." He paused, watching Tommy's mother carefully plant her son's favorite toy car alongside his name. "But I worry about the town council. Technically, this could be seen as an unauthorized cemetery." Sarah thought of her ex-husband's lawyer, always looking for ammunition. "Let me handle that," she said, surprising herself with the firmness in her voice. "I may not be practicing law anymore, but I still remember how." Over the following days, Sarah threw herself into research, finding precedents for memorial gardens, therapeutic horticulture, and grief rituals. She discovered that Millbrook's zoning laws had a provision for community healing spaces that had never been utilized. Working late into the nights, she prepared a proposal that would protect Elias's garden while allowing it to serve the community openly. Emma called one evening, as Sarah was deep in legal documents. "Mum, I've been thinking about Mr. Thornton's garden for my senior thesis. My advisor is really interested. She says it's a perfect example of grassroots mental health support." "It's more than that," Sarah said, looking out her window at the garden, now dotted with small solar lights that families had begun to add. "It's teaching us how to grieve together again. How to make space for sadness in a world that wants us to always be okay." The next morning brought unexpected rain, but Sarah saw Elias in his garden anyway, kneeling in the mud. She grabbed her raincoat and joined him. "You don't have to do this every day," she said, rain streaming down her face. "Yes, I do," he replied, his hands deep in the wet earth. "The names need tending, rain or shine. Grief doesn't take days off." She knelt beside him, not caring about the mud soaking through her jeans. "Whose name today?" "My own," he said quietly, showing her the paper. "Not Elias Thornton, but the man who was afraid to feel." I realized I've been planting everyone else's grief, but holding on to my own fear. Fear of feeling too much, of being seen as weak, of admitting that 15 years later I still wake up, reaching for Clara. Together they planted his fear in the rain-soaked earth, their hands working side by side. When they finished, Sarah pulled out her own paper, the one she'd been carrying for days. The woman who stopped believing in growth. Not anymore, Elias asked. Not anymore, she confirmed, placing it gently in the ground. The town council meeting was held on a Thursday evening in the basement of the Lutheran church, fluorescent lights flickering over folding chairs and coffee urns that had seen better days. Sarah sat in the front row, her proposal clutched in her hands, while Elias sat beside her in his only suit, the one he'd worn to Clara's funeral. Behind them, the room was packed. Maria Santos with her children, the Chens, the Brennans, and dozens of others, who had found solace in the garden. Even Emma had driven up from college, bringing 3 classmates who were documenting the meeting for their social work program. Council President Janet Fitzgerald called the meeting to order, her expression skeptical. "We're here to discuss the unusual use of Mr. Thornton's property and whether it constitutes a zoning violation." "It's a garden, Janet," called out Henry Chen. "Since when is gardening a violation?" "Since it potentially involves human remains," Janet replied stiffly. "There are no human remains." Sarah stood, her voice carrying the authority of her former courtroom days. "Only papers with names, biodegradable papers with vegetable-based inks, I might add. Mr. Thornton's garden is a memorial space, not a cemetery." And so she presented her proposal, outlining how the garden fit within existing zoning laws, how it provided a mental health service to the community, and how it could become a model for other towns grappling with collective grief. Emma and her classmates presented data on the psychological benefits of ritual in grief processing, while Maria Santos spoke about how the garden had helped her children understand their father's death. But it was Elias who delivered the most powerful testimony. Standing slowly, his hands steady now, he spoke about Clara, about the pandemic, about the epidemic of loneliness and unprocessed grief plaguing their small town. "We've forgotten how to mourn together," he said simply. "We've forgotten that grief is not a problem to be solved, but a love to be carried. My garden doesn't fix grief, it honors it. It says, your loss matters, your love mattered, and there is still beauty to be found in the broken places." Tommy Brennan's father stood up suddenly. "My son is buried in Riverside Cemetery," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "But that's just his body, his spirit, his memory, the hole he left in our lives. That's in Mr. Thornton's garden. That's where I go to feel close to him, to feel like his death meant something, like his life is still growing, something beautiful." One by one, others stood to speak. The garden had become more than a place of mourning. It had become a place of connection. Neighbors who hadn't spoken in years had found themselves crying together over shared losses. Teenagers struggling with depression had found purpose in tending the plants. The elderly had found a way to prepare for their own deaths, knowing their names would be planted with love. Janet Fitzgerald called for a recess, and the council members huddled in whispered conference. Sarah reached over and squeezed Elias's hand. "Whatever happens," she whispered, "you've already won. You've changed this town." When the council reconvened, Janet's expression had softened. "The council has voted to designate Mr. Thornton's garden as an official community healing space, the first in Massachusetts. We're also recommending it for a state grant for therapeutic horticulture programs." The room erupted in applause. Maria Santos hugged Elias, tears streaming down her face. Emma and her classmates were already planning a documentary. Henry Chen was shaking everyone's hands like they'd won the World Series. But Sarah noticed Elias had slipped outside. She found him in the parking lot, looking up at the stars just beginning to appear in the darkening sky. "You did it," she said softly. "We did it," he corrected. "But I'm scared, Sarah. It was easier when it was just me and the names. Now it's something bigger, something I can't control." "That's what growth is," Sarah said, thinking of her own planted fears. "It's messy and uncertain and sometimes painful, but it's also beautiful." She paused, then added, "Clara would be proud." Elias smiled, the first full smile she'd seen from him. She would. She'd probably also be planning a proper garden party with her terrible cucumber sandwiches. They laughed together in the parking lot, two people who had found each other through grief and discovered something unexpected growing from that dark soil: hope. 6 months later, on a perfect October afternoon, the garden hosted its first official harvest of memory. Families brought photos and stories of those they'd planted, sharing meals and memories. Emma's documentary had attracted attention from grief counselors across the country, and similar gardens were being planned in 3 other states. Elias stood at the garden's entrance, greeting visitors, his canvas bag retired now in favor of a proper registration book where people could record their plantings. Sarah worked beside him, having left her legal career behind to become the garden's first official coordinator. As the sun set over Millbrook, casting golden light over the rows of growing things, Sarah watched a new widow kneel to plant her husband's name. The woman's children stood beside her, each holding their own papers, memories they wanted to plant and tend. The gardener planted names in the soil, Sarah murmured, and everyone knew why. Elias nodded, his eyes bright with unshed tears. Because love doesn't die, he said. It just changes form. Sometimes, if we're lucky and brave enough to tend it, it becomes a garden where broken hearts learn to grow again. The garden would continue long after Elias and Sarah were gone, their own names eventually planted in that rich soil, but for now they stood together, guardians of grief and cultivation of hope, teaching a small Massachusetts town that the deepest sorrows, when planted with care and witnessed with love, could grow into something beautiful and lasting. In the end, the garden was never really about death at all. It was about the courage to feel deeply, to mourn honestly, and to believe that even in loss, life finds a way to bloom.